So tonight's topic is Islam in early America, from slavery to civil rights movement. A relevant topic given that we are still in the month of February celebrating Black History Month. And this Haris will give us an overview and an in-depth analysis of that history. But just a quick word about how this relates to our understanding of Islam, especially in the early part of the history of Islam. And I think one of the things that is not often acknowledged and talked about is the role that the Africans played in the early formation of the early Islamic society, with people that were Africans, or they had mixed sort of heritage that were part of the Meccan community. People that we know, like Bilal and others, and also we know about Hijrah and the Hijrah to Medina, but we probably should also talk about the first Hijrah, which was to Abyssinia, which was to Habasha, which gives us that early connection that Islam has with with those of African origin, and how that community and individuals from that community played such a significant role in the early days of Islam. And so the role that they play here in America, that's just so crucial, but it also reminds us of that early connection. So it's sort of a revival, I think, of how Islam was initially it spread, and the community as an ummah, it formed. That same thing again happened in America when Islam was first brought to these shores. I think it's important for us to reflect on that and inshallah learn from that, especially in this day and age, and this time that civil liberties are being curtailed. There is all this pushback against minorities, those who are considered not to be sort of from the dominant culture. There's that pushback that we are seeing right now, and so I think it really helps us if we look back into our history in America as Muslims and see what are the lessons we can learn and what are the things we can revive to build that resilience, that power that we all need as a collective to fight against racism and xenophobia, and to really fight for the ideals that this country has always stood for. And this country has always been about those ideals. It has not lived up to those ideals, but that's our role, that's our struggle, is to continue to make America a place where everyone can thrive and everyone's welcome. And so without going into any further scattered thoughts, I would hand it off to Haris, who will inshallah tell us a lot more about this.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I mean, it's not that cold. It's not that cold.
Everyone needs to wake up.
Yeah, you can. I mean, the cold weather is supposed to wake you up, not put you to sleep. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. Thank you, Imam Zia, for the introduction. I wanted to start off by making a few points tonight as we discuss, as we have a conversation around early Islam in America and why we're talking about it, and the significance, but also reflecting on a few different points. The first is that it is Black History Month, right? It's Black History Month, and at MakeSpace, I think you guys are having a series of sessions on different topics. I know you had a conversation about the life of Imam Muhammad,
Right.
or is that coming up? It's already.
think we did that one.
That already happened, correct? Yeah. So the conversation about the life of Imam Deen Muhammad, who is one of the individuals who really changed Islam in America and the direction of Islam in America in so many ways. Number two, I think you'll probably have more sessions about the Black American Muslim experience, because in this month it's important to reflect on the Black American Muslim experience from America's founding until today, and how it's shaped America, not only Islam and Muslims in America, but actually how it shaped America. And we'll talk a little bit about that today, and why Islam, Black Muslims actually changed and shifted America, not just Islam in America, not just religion, but America itself, and how Islam was used as a tool of resistance, and we'll go into why that was used as a resistance tool against tyranny and oppression and so much. But it's important to recognize that, and I think and I know MakeSpace is going to have a series of programs highlighting the experiences of Black Muslims in America. Today what we wanted to do was really take a step back and look at early Islam in America, we're not going to get a full picture of early Islam America, of Islam in America, but we'll take snapshots of how Islam looked in real early America, from before America's actual founding. Even before America's founding, we had individuals, where you had experiences, and why is that important? Number one, so I'll ask you a few questions, and I'd love your participation in this, because this is an engaging session, this is not a lecture. When you think of Islam or Muslims in America, what do you think about? Don't give it too much thought, just what do you think about?
Immigration.
Migration, what else? What do you think about?
In the modern day or in historically?
Doesn't matter. And when someone tells you, oh, what's Islam in America, what would your response be to them? If an alien came down and said, what is Islam in America? What would be your response to them?
Diversity.
Huh? Diversity, okay, that's good. What else? Brotherhood, great.
Richest minority.
Minorities? One of the richest minorities. I don't know if we're the richest yet, but one of the richest. One of them, good. Anything else?
Institution?
Dearborn, Michigan.
Exactly, Dearborn, Michigan. I think a lot of people would actually say that. That's a very good point. What else?
Institutions?
Institutions? Okay. And what do you mean by institutions?
You know, like there are a lot of Islamic bodies in the United States, like
Yeah.
registered as, for example, like
Okay.
Islamic organizations.
Organizations, mosques, and
Yeah.
all of those things. What else? Did you have some?
I was gonna say like ICNA and ISNA and
Organizations,
all the conferences
yeah.
getting together.
All the gatherings, the matrimonial services at the gatherings, all that stuff. What else? Anything else? Yeah.
I would think underrepresentation.
Underrepresentation. That makes a lot of sense. Anything else before we continue? But I mean, that's important, and you know, it's a very diverse set of things that Islam means in America. But a lot of people would essentially equate Islam in America as not being compatible, as Islam being foreign to the American experience. A lot of what we just mentioned, except a few of them, talk about Islam as being a modern phenomenon, right? As something that's modern day, as something that's post-immigration, the immigration bills of the 1960s and 70s. They don't really think of Islam as being part of the early American experience. And that's important to identify, because people who write history, those who actually write history, determine the narrative, right? They determine the narrative. And when you determine the narrative, you put into people's mind how they should look at themselves and how people should look at them. So if you tell someone that Islam is about immigration, if you tell someone that Islam is about Dearborn, right? And love Dearborn, it's great, I've been to it, the food is amazing, the sweets are the best. But if you tell people Islam is Dearborn, Islam is immigration, Islam is ISNA, ICNA, these organizations that were founded post the 1970s, if Islam is modern day mosques, what does that tell you? That tells you that Islam is not indigenous to the American experience. That tells you that Islam is very new to America. That tells you that you should feel that Islam and your experience as Muslims, forget even the word Islam, but Muslims, that your experience is in many ways foreign. It's not authentic. It's not American. It is a foreign experience that is very new. That's how most Americans actually view Muslims and Islam. But what happens to us, that's okay, that we can address the issue of perception, but we internalize that. We internalize the fact that we are a community that is not indigenous to this nation. And what happens is we teach that to our kids, we teach that in our schools, we teach that in our institutions, and that ends up creating a narrative that says Islam was not indigenous to this country, was not part of the founding of this country, was not part of the conversations in this country. One thing, reflect on one thing. There were more Muslims in America during its founding than there were Jews. Nobody would even nobody would even think about that. There was more Muslims in America during its founding. We'll talk about where they came from, but the actual numbers. There were more Muslims in this country during the founding of this nation than there were Jews or than there were Hindus or Buddhists. But we call this nation a Judeo-Christian nation, right? Well, of course, for certain reasons. But if you look at the actual narrative of the founding of America, but people don't reflect about that. But when people talk about Jews, do they think of Jews as foreign to America? And we'll talk about why that potentially could be racialization. But people don't think Jews as foreign to America or recent immigrants, even though many Jews are recent immigrants to this country. They were post-World War II. The majority of Jews that came to America came post-World War II. And they settled in this country, just like many Muslims did in Dearborn, just like many Muslims did in other parts of the country. But you don't think that when you think of the word of the Jewish experience in America, you don't think of a foreign experience. So those are some of the reasons why it's important to understand where we fit in terms of even creating our own narrative, because we have developed this narrative that we are a community that is young, that's new, that's foreign, and that we internalize that to a large extent, and then we pass it down to our children, and that creates a narrative that's not accurate. That's not accurate, and we'll see why that's not accurate in the next few minutes. So we're going to do a quick snapshot of Muslims, and I don't like using the term Islam in America, even though I use it here, but it's really the Muslim experience in America, and who we were, how we were part of this nation, and then what we can talk about. We can talk a little bit about a modern day as well in another conversation. So a few things to reflect on. Islam has actually been present in America, in the American experience, since the earliest days of this transatlantic slave trade. So that means what? That means that Islam was, Muslims were present in this country even prior to its founding. If you look at enslaved African Americans, African Muslims, played a significant role in shaping early Black American culture. This is fact. If you look at, and we'll talk about why that is because of the numbers, but they helped shape Black Muslim or Black life in America. Many of them were Muslims, and many of them, much of the language and the culture and the history came from African Muslims as well. Over time, Islam continued to influence Black liberation movements, culminating in the civil rights era. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. So I said, when we talked about African slaves who came to this country, and then later on even during the Jim Crow era and the civil rights era, Islam was used by African Americans as a liberation tool. because post the Civil War, when the Civil War ended in this country, a phenomenon took place. Black people were still figuring out identities in the South. Many of them were trying to figure out who they were, where they came from. And what happened was the state and the institutions of the state, so the church, which was very close to the state itself, law enforcement agencies, started a Christianization of black culture in America, and we'll talk about what that looked like. Many people were still trying to figure out roots and heritage and background. But right before and then with a lot of force, right after the Civil War, there was a Christianization of black communities around the country, especially in the South, that took place, that erased a lot of cultural heritage that came from Africa amongst African Americans or Africans at that time. So, but there was a rebirth, and we'll talk about the rebirth. In the 20th, early 20th century, late 19th century, there was a rebirth because there was a rediscovery of culture in black communities that brought Islam back, and we'll talk about what that looked like. But these were some of the realities of early Islam in America. Yeah.
Before you
Please.
move forward, are there any traces of Islam in America outside of the African American community and the indigenous native populations, or amongst even some of those who colonized America?
Yeah.
You kind of sometimes read bits and pieces about some evidence of that.
Right.
How much truth is there to any of that?
So I think there's probably some truth. My wife asked me that on the way here. Are you going to talk about the Native American pretend? So I don't have. So I, I have actually not. I don't know. So I have to be honest with that, right? So I don't know about the influence of Islam on Native communities here in America. I'm sure. I know that there is some conversation. I think she was saying that ISPU did a study that looked into that. And maybe we can look at that at another time. That might be a really fascinating to look at. And then also,
maybe Lila can share what she knows now.
Yeah, do you know?
I would rather go back to the report
Study.
before sharing.
Yeah.
it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's keep to facts.
Yeah, so I'm sure there is. I don't know, and so I have, hopefully that would be a time for us to kind of, I know that there was other, not at that time, but and we'll talk about this. There was other influences from other parts of the world that came, but it was post Civil War. So there were communities that came from Syria and Lebanon, and we can talk about that as well. And it was in very early stages. Syria and Lebanese communities that settled in Southwest America, places like Arizona and Nevada. There was, of course, Dearborn, Lebanon, where there was a post-World War II migration that came into. There was a very interesting, there's an interesting article, and we can send this around, by a Moorish Muslim from Spain who was brought as a slave of some of the folks who, the Spaniards, the explorers who went to South America and then came to the US. One of the Moorish slaves of the explorers attained his freedom and was the one who actually established a colony of Nevada. So a Muslim was the one who established a colony of Nevada, and that's something to think about. There was someone by the name of Hijali. We should look into that, and maybe another session we can do some of these figures. Hijali was a Syrian Christian who became Muslim, went to Hajj, became Muslim, was an expert in camel training. So the U.S. Department of Defense, post-World War I, wanted to develop a camel battalion to explore, to easily kind of go through east to west and open areas up in the Southwest. he was brought, and he became the official, the first individual to try to create a camel battalion for the U.S. Army. It didn't work. Camels were not very indigenous to American lands, but what he did was he settled in Arizona. He settled in Arizona, and he built the last part of Route 60, famous Route 66. You know the famous Route 66? From Arizona to California, he helped lay the foundation for that. He has an official monument in Arizona, in the Quartzsite, Arizona, small little town in Arizona called Quartzsite, but they know him as High Jolly. So we went to visit his grave when we were driving. We did a cross-country trip. We went to visit his grave, and his name, you know, they have it as High Jolly, but his name was Hajj Ali. So there are individuals like that, and he built a mosque there, and he was. So there are individuals like that, but you know, but it doesn't go far back as. But we could definitely look at the Native American experience as well.
I'd add that.
Please.
Last year we invited the producer of the Great Muslim American Road Trip.
Mona?
And it talks,
Yeah.
it talks about like everything we discussed. If there's something that you want to watch to get home.
PBS, yeah.
Yes.
That's right, a series on PBS called The Great American Muslim Experience.
The Great Muslim American Road Trip.
Great Muslim, okay, yeah, great. And then there's also another series on PBS about early Islam in America, and it documents some of these issues. So if you look at Muslims in PBS, you'll definitely see a lot of this. So let's look at some of the facts of early Muslims in this country from its founding. The estimation is about 30% of enslaved Africans brought to America were Muslim. About 30%. Now that's a significant population. If you look at the overall number of enslaved Africans who came to this country, about 30%. The one thing that not many people talk about is that the 30% of the Muslims who came to this country, a lot of them were the ones in Africa who were actually educated and from communities who were literate and actually part of societies that were more advanced than the other parts of Africa. So you had places like Mali, you had places like Senegal, you had other places where Muslims were brought from, enslaved and brought from. They were the ones who were actually literate, who could read, who could write. And so that is a very specific fact about Muslims who were enslaved. They were generally the ones who were able to pass notes around during times of between the slaves. They were part of the Underground Railroad, and they used to help in passing notes and writing things. So you'll see that was a trend, because a lot of the places where Muslims had settled in Africa had become very prosperous communities and small cities in Africa where education was robust, both for women and for men. So that's something that a lot of people don't pay attention to, but the Muslims that came here, a lot of them were literate, and 30% of the population. Many came from places like Senegal, the Gambia, Mali, Nigeria, and these were the places that were actually quite prosperous in Africa at that time. And they had flourished. They had civilizations in many parts of Africa where Muslims came from. Enslaved people, and we'll go through some of the details, people like Omar bin Said, and we'll talk about him. Yaro Mahmoud, who's my favorite, Muslim in the early, and he has a connection here to Washington and Georgetown, and you should definitely go check it out and see the connection that he had to Georgetown. And Ayuba Sulaiman Diallo, these were people who were actual scholars of Islam and science, who had been taken as slaves, and they eventually made a name for themselves even here when they were enslaved and then became free. What was unique, the first Muslim, and we'll talk about this, the first Muslim to attain, the first slave, not Muslim, I'm sorry, to attain their freedom and then go back to Africa was a Muslim. That was the first person to actually attain their freedom, go back to Africa, and we'll talk about how they did that. So there was, they also left behind a lot of writing, Arabic, proving their literacy and faith. And then despite, there was a very large attempt to erase anything culturally, any identity of enslaved Africans. When they came here, and you know this, many of you were really young, you probably saw the movie Kunta Kinte, Roots, right? About Kunta Kinte. That's literally what they would do, is erasure of identity. That's what it was, erasure of identity. So religious identity, cultural identity, all of that would be erased. But we'll talk about how some of these individuals actually kept their identity, passed it on through generations. So the first person to look at that's fascinating of the early individuals, someone by the name of Umar bin Said. He was a Futa Toro in modern day Senegal. It was called Futa Toro, and he was trained as an Islamic scholar. He was a scholar of Islamic law. He had studied, and he was enslaved and brought to South Carolina in 1807, and then moved to North Carolina. But Umar bin Said was very, very interesting. He wrote an autobiography. He wrote something about himself in Arabic while he was enslaved, and he was the only known example by an enslaved person in the U.S. who actually wrote about themselves and wrote and published about themselves. He accepted Christianity publicly, but privately he remained Muslim because he was forced to accept Christianity. But he wrote all of this work in private, and after he passed, much of it was discovered. And a lot of writing of Quran, and he's writing tafsir, and it all was discovered after. This was Umar bin Said. And that was some of his actual writing that he compiled, that he left behind after he passed. Any questions, any comments so far? Any contributions? The other person was Ayuba Sulaiman Diallo. That's very interesting to look at. He was quite wealthy, actually, educated, and from Senegal again, from the Banda region. He was captured, and the way and a lot of people don't know how many people would be captured and enslaved. So there would be tribal conflict. There was tribal conflict in Africa, regions, ethnic conflicts, tribal conflicts that would take place. And one of the things that would happen is when tribes would fight amongst themselves, when there would be conflict of tribe amongst themselves, the tribes that actually were victorious would take their men as slaves. And a lot of time what they realized was that they would enslave them and they would keep them. But when the transatlantic slave trade took place and started, what they realized was that if they sell the enslaved people that they took during conflict, they would make a lot more profit. So what happened was, within certain cities around Africa, this trade network was set up, where first it was haphazard. If there was a conflict between multiple tribes, they would take people into slavery, and then they would sell them. Then they started actually going after people and hunting people, because the amount of profit that they would take due to the transatlantic slave trade was so big that they would actually go and hunt people. And you had slave hunters, people who would actually, their livelihood was to go and find people. They would track them down, and many of these Muslim scholars and students actually they would be traveling from town to town to teach people Islam, to do what they call to do dawah, and they were captured in between towns and enslaved and brought to the U.S. So this whole trade network that was set up in Africa itself, many people think that it was the Europeans that would go in. It was a lot of times the Europeans would not actually go on land. The Europeans would just be waiting at certain ports of entry, and then these slaves were brought to them by locals and tribal leaders. So he was captured into slavery. and brought to slavery in 1731. Some of the things he left behind and that he did is he wrote in Arabic, and he wrote eloquently, and he had great penmanship, which actually impressed a lot of his British officials and the people who had taken him into slavery. He was the one who actually gained his freedom and returned to West Africa on a British passport. He was in the US, was able to gain his freedom, went to the UK, lived in the UK, got a British passport, and then went back home. One of the first cases that we know of someone actually returning back home after they had achieved their freedom. And his story, and if you want to read it, it's actually a book that you can read. His memoirs. It's one of the earliest slave narratives that exist, and if you Google it, you can actually find it and read it, and they've translated it into a modern language as well. And this is him. This is Ayuba Sulaiman Diallo. That was a sample of his writing as well. Then there was Yara Mahmoud, that I think is important for us to know, because he was a local, and he is actually, I'm fascinated by his story. He was amazing. And you can go to Georgetown to actually look for the plaque, because he lived in Georgetown, and he's buried in Georgetown. They have not been able to actually find his burial site, but we know that he's buried in Georgetown. And the Georgetown University's mosque, has anybody been to the masjid, Georgetown University? The masjid is actually named after him. It's the Yara Mahmoud Mosque inside of Georgetown University. So he was a formerly enslaved African Muslim who actually became a very successful businessman, because he was literate and because he had experience in business prior to even being enslaved. One of the things his story does, and you'll see how he actually changed narratives, it really highlights how early Muslims and enslaved African Muslims were impactful on people around them, and their stories remained. For a while, unfortunately, their stories kind of were hidden. People didn't do the research to actually reveal their stories, but their stories are part of early America, and they actually had impact around them. And with, of course, the growth of Islam in America and American Muslims, now we're starting to see these stories come back and come out. And there's so many of these stories that are in archives, in libraries, in places where we have not actually searched. But I will tell you, probably as we do more research, you're going to see so many more names of individuals and the impact that they had around them in their communities come out. He was born most likely in Guinea or in Senegal to a Muslim family. He was young, 16 years old when he was captured, but he was already reading and writing, and he had actually memorized the Quran before then, before the age of 16. He was brought, of course, through the transatlantic slave trade to Maryland, and he was enslaved for 40 years. He had different masters for 40 years. He was enslaved. He worked as a laborer, but he also then worked as a household servant. And he had so many skills that he was one of the most, in the plantation in Maryland, he was given a lot of responsibilities of managing the plantation. This is Yara Mahmoud, and he is the only slave who was of course freed, but who had their official portrait done, right? Official portrait done. And the person who painted this portrait right here of him was the one who was the most famous portrait painter of his time. The one who also painted George Washington's portrait, Thomas Jefferson's portrait, and Ben Franklin's portrait, and painted this because he saw his story. He was fascinated by him, and not only that, when Yara Mahmoud passed away, he had an obituary written about him in 32 different newspapers. And the official obituary of him was written by the person who actually did his portrait. And if you go to Georgetown, this is in Georgetown, there's a marker of his residence and his home and his burial site, even though they don't have the actual site itself, but they have a plaque about him. So he's the only individual that we know, the only former slave who had 2 portraits of him done at that time. So you can see the amount of the impact that he had on his community, and he was one of the individuals who helped build out Georgetown, and you'll see all of the nice Georgetown that you see today. He was one of the individuals that actually invested in Georgetown and helped build Georgetown out. And when you talk about investment, what do we mean? He was freed in 1796, so 40 years after his enslavement. He, in that process, became a brick maker, then eventually saved enough money, became a property owner, which was extremely rare at this time. Extremely rare for an African former slave to save enough money and actually become a property owner. And then he invested in a bank, a new bank that was forming, was called Columbia Bank in Georgetown. It was forming at that point, and one of his friends told him, you should invest in this bank. Invested in the bank, and the bank really took off. And so he was one of the first investors of the bank, but then also a lot of property in Georgetown. He owned stocks, which is extremely rare. At that time, only white men owned stocks. And even amongst white men, it was very rare to own stocks. You own land, but not many people own stock. He had a home, which again was very rare. He practiced Islam openly. And even though he had a lot of pressure to convert to Christianity, and in the books written about him, he actually used to walk down the streets of Georgetown, and people would say he would sing Arabic hymns as he was walking down the streets of Georgetown. And of course we have documents of his and writings of his that he left behind. He used to fast, and very publicly. So this is all public. This was what was interesting is that all of this we know from people who were either his neighbors or business partners or people who had business with him. So he left writings in Arabic, and it was the artist Charles Wilson Peale who painted that portrait and also wrote his obituary. So that was the impact that someone like Yara Mahmoud had. And you don't hear those stories, right? You don't hear, even amongst slaves, you don't hear these stories of people of resilience, of endurance, and of people who overcame 40 years. Imagine 40 years of being a slave, and then you become a successful person, right? Despite all the odds. One of the challenges when, after emancipation happened, there was a lot of hope that people would be able to build businesses, to own land, to own property, and that hope was there. But of course, the state, that's another conversation. We know what the state did to ensure that didn't happen, but he was one of those exceptions. Freedom after 40 years of slavery, and then immense amount of success in his life, and then left it for his children as well.
I think it's interesting to note that he wasn't really young when he was freed. He was like, what, 56 or?
Yeah.
And he accomplished all that.
Yeah, starting at the age of 56. And not only that, twice after he was freed, so one time he invested with a person who went bankrupt. So he lost everything once. So twice. The second time he was scammed. So he had savings twice. Twice after he was freed, he essentially lost everything, but then started again. So immense resilience, immense amounts of resilience. And then if you fast forward, like we said, we're going to take snapshots. We're not going to go into detail. So if you fast forward a little bit and you look at early Islam and then right post the Civil War. So this is all before the Civil War. If you look at post Civil War, there was a lot of hope and expectation that once freedom came, that many individuals can start to explore their identities, their culture, their background, where they came from, and how it impacted them. And that didn't happen, unfortunately. As we mentioned, there was almost this militant Christianization and of recently freed African communities, especially in the South. You had all of these missionaries, and you had Bible schools that just popped up, and you had all these people trying to convert the newly freed slaves and make sure that they became Christian. And much in that process, many people actually did not start to explore their background, their culture, their history, and their identity. And so the forced conversion to Christianity banned anything at the local level that had to do with culture, Islam, African culture, any of that life. All of that was banned at local level. There was different states and different local localities where that looked different, but in large, there was a ban of anything that had to do with your previous identity. So then what happened was some of the individuals practiced in secret. You know, some of them kept fasting and praying, but as generations passed, and you see this with immigrant communities, as generations pass, if you don't have institutions, if you can't build those institutions publicly, if you can't worship publicly, you eventually lose those identities. Any reflections and thoughts, questions? Yes, please.
You know, I bumped in one time. I was reading. I like to read a lot of things about history, and I bumped into one video where it shows that George Washington actually had a Quran with him, and that he used the phrase where it says, you know, with freedom of religion.
Thomas Jefferson?
Yeah.
Yeah, Thomas Jefferson. Yeah.
No, George Washington.
So it was Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, so it is, and we still have that until today, actually.
Yeah,
It's in the Library of Congress. No, you're right. So Thomas Jefferson is interesting. So not only did he have a Quran with him, he actually in the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which our federal Bill of Rights is based on, he talks about Mohammedans, which he referred to as Muslims. They used to refer to Muslims as Mohammedans. It's an Orientalist term. He talks about Mohammedans being able to practice freely. And he hosted the first iftar in the White House when he was president, at Thomas Jefferson's time. I mean, the ambassador of Tunisia came to meet with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wanted to offer him a meal, and it was during the month of Ramadan. His staff told him that this person is fasting, so they said, we will then host an iftar, and so the first iftar was hosted by Thomas Jefferson. But you're right, the Quran still exists today, and Keith Ellison, when he became the first Muslim member of Congress in 2008, he did his oath on that Quran of Thomas Jefferson, which is, yes.
When seeing all the history of Muslims in America, do we have when you talk about the forced conversions, slavery, and 30% of them are Muslims, do you have something like the Muslims have resisted against these things and they contribute for them? They have actually fought for their civil rights and these things?
Yes, of course. So number one, existence itself was a form of resistance. Many of them for decades, as you see, they resisted by practicing. They resisted by making sure that they wrote even in secret, and they passed it on to their kids. So that was that individual form of resistance, because when they were actually in slavery, you couldn't organize resistance, right? And that was one of the militant approach to slavery in this country, was that you would allow no organization to take place, right? So the militant response by law enforcement, by slave masters, by the state, didn't allow for organizing to take place, but you had individuals who resisted. And those are documented, many cases of those. What's interesting is that there is a rebirth of resistance, and we'll talk about why. There was a rebirth of resistance after the Civil War, and then that helped spur and contribute to the Civil Rights Movement, and we'll talk about that.
I think there's a hand.
Yes, please.
In Yarrow Mahmoud's lifetime,
Yeah.
you didn't give the time frame for that. Like, what years were those?
Let me, so he was freed in 1796. He was 56 years old when he was freed. So that was from probably 1750s to about 1810, something like that.
So my question is like, how was he able to do all these things, like own property, invest in stocks, when like there were laws banning people of enslavement and African Americans, obviously at that time, from doing those things. So how was he able to do that?
So he obtained his freedom.
Okay.
So after 40 years, so the laws were against, of course, people who were enslaved,
Okay.
not freemen.
Okay.
So when even though after he was free, so all of the accomplishments was after the age of 56 when he obtained his freedom. But even then, there was discrimination. So what he would, and this is, if you read about his life, and there's a whole book about him. When you read about he was very charismatic. So he actually had business partners in Georgetown who were white men that facilitated a lot of business for him, because discrimination, of course, was rampant. But he did all of that after he was freed. So those laws didn't apply to him. But even though there was discrimination, he was very adept at being able to kind of, have friendships and partnerships that got around some of those issues.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Those business partners would always note his good character.
Yes.
That he was a very reliable, trustworthy person. So
Yeah.
in essence, it's like, the Prophet was known as Sadiq al-Amin, the truthful and the trustworthy. And that's, he kind of was taking on those same qualities which we're all supposed to take on. But it's what makes people trust him and say, hey, this is an authentic person that we should be supporting, despite all of the other things that they trust him. And
Please.
and all of the individuals you mentioned are actually highlighted in the Museum of African American History because they're the ones that there's so much information about, because they wrote and they documented things. So it's interesting when you go to the museum that it's the Muslims who are highlighted.
Yeah. Well, that tells you the importance of documenting and writing your story and history, because it's the only way it survives. If you don't do it, the victor is usually the one who writes history. But here you can say the documenter is the one who also can write history, as long as you're documenting and you're preserving. So around this time now, the post-Civil War era, after slavery has been abolished in 1865, right? And then slowly after that, guess what starts to happen? What starts to slowly happen now? Slavery is abolished, you lose free labor. What starts to happen?
Things become expensive.
Yeah, things become expensive, yes. But now you need more laborers. So you start to, immigration now starts to trickle in. So now that you need more laborers, now that you don't have the same level of labor that's available to you, right? You start to now bring in more individuals to start to work in different fields. And also this is the time when industrialization starts to take place. America is slowly moving from an agrarian, not slowly, actually really fast, moved from an agrarian society to a industrial society. And with industrial movement into the industrial society, you need labor, and you need lots of labor. And so what happened was, there's a couple of things that starts to take place. You have internal migration that takes place inside of America, where you have what's called a second migration of black communities take place. They go from the south to the north, to places like Chicago, New York, Boston, Minneapolis. You got all these places, DC, where black communities move from the south because now they're free and the opportunities in the south no longer exist. They are moving up to industrial towns and cities, and then migration starts to take place from the Middle East also. So from China, but also from the Ottoman Empire. So you have places like Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Turkey, where migration starts to take place, and also North Africa. So if you go to Arizona, you will see a small town in Arizona called Sana'a. This is where a group of Yemeni farmers who were experts at farming in desert climate were brought to Yemen to start to farm in desert climate in Yemen. And so they built small communities. You had Lebanese, a large Lebanese population. Have you heard of, on the West Coast, in certain parts of the Midwest, Basha's grocery store?
Yes.
Basha is a Lebanese family who came here many, many, many years ago and established. If you drive across the US and you stop at places like Kentucky, you stop in places like Missouri, you go to small towns, you'll see really small towns called Lebanon, Damascus. I mean, so many different, Mecca, because you had small communities of now immigrants who started to come to the US because immigration was needed at that point. Both Muslim and Christian populations from the Ottoman Empire. So that starts to happen. Yeah.
I just want to add one thing. The history of Tyson's meat owner. I met them in person a couple of years ago. So he told me that his grandfather was a Muslim. And they migrated in early 90s, and then he married a Christian, and after that, story.
Yeah, there's a lot of those stories, much of those stories. And the one thing is that the people from the Middle East especially were very entrepreneurial. So places like Lebanon. So if you even go to South America, you'll see Palestinian, Lebanese, Syrian communities that are in South America and quite entrepreneurial and successful in South America. The richest man in South America, in Mexico, Carlos Slim, is Lebanese, of Lebanese origin as well. So you had but this was the time where these migration shifts started to happen. And then during the early 1900s, and this is the question that came up, there was a sort of revival that started to take place, especially within black communities in America, because of Jim Crow, because you had immense segregation taking place. All of the promises of freedom and emancipation, none of them came to fruition. The mule and the 5 acres and the mule and all of that, none of that was promised to freed slaves, none of that came to fruition. There was a cultural shift that happened in America. You had the rise of the KKK and white supremacist groups. This is when the KKK was formed. You had immense amount of lynching and violence against black communities that started to happen. And the era of Jim Crow started. And so you see a cultural shift that's very similar to the cultural shift we're moving towards right now, which is really interesting. You have the right-wing groups, very conservative, just like what's his name, the Vice President J.D. Vance just said last week in Europe, we should stop isolating our right-wing groups now. We should encourage them to come out into the open. And you've seen over the past 12 years in America a shift towards normalization of white supremacist groups. What did that coincide with? Can anybody take a guess?
Election of Obama.
Election of a black president, right? So America has always been a very racially charged nation. So when Obama was elected, by the end of his second term, there was an 1,800% increase in white supremacist groups in this country. So, and of course, who was elected right after Obama? Donald Trump. And the rhetoric that Donald Trump used. So you see these cultural shifts, cultural and racial shifts that take place, and this time was one of them. And so black communities, what they had to start to do was organize. Jim Crow, lynchings, violence. This is when the NAACP was formed. This is when a lot of black advocacy groups started to be formed. This is when a movement of especially black pastors and black churches start to form and organize and protect each other at this point. So what do black communities do specifically? They then start to look at what makes sense for us to organize around. Do we organize around religion? Do we organize around identity? Do we organize around history? And of course there was different movements within that organizing that took place. The black church became the center of much of the organizing. So black churches were vibrant, were the center, but then there was a strand that started to that were not content with Christianity and Christian values, that started to look back now and say, where did we come from? So a lot of that self-reflection started to happen, and people started to kind of think about where they came from, what was their identity, and this is where you start to then develop groups like in 1913, the Moorish Science Temple. This was one of the first attempts. The Moorish, the fascinating history, the Moorish Science Temple took values and aspects of Islam, of Christianity, and other faiths, and created, and they started to create a theology for themselves, a resistance theology that they started to organize around. This is when you had Noble Drew Ali was one of the founders of this. And this is also slowly when you get the beginnings of the Nation of Islam as well, where you have Fard Muhammad, and then also a community that not many people talk about, the Ahmadiyya movement in America. So that Ahmadiyya movement that was in South Asia mainly, in Pakistan and in India, they were one of the first groups around the world, before the Tablighi Jamaats and before the Deobandis like we talked about, and even before the Salafis and all these groups, who actually immigrated to make dawah in America. And the Ahmadiyyas sent representatives to the US to establish centers to call people to Islam and to the Ahmadiyya movement. So places like Chicago, New York, the first mosque that was established in downtown Chicago was the Ahmadiyya Center. And who did they target to go convert and bring to Islam? African American communities. So if you look in Chicago, they had a publication. They centered their headquarters in Chicago. They started to invite African American communities to Islam. And the first actually representative that they hired full-time, who used to go out and make dawah, was an African American man that would go bring other African Americans, men and women, to Islam through the Ahmadiyya movement. So the Moorish Science Temple, the Nation of Islam, the Ahmadiyya movement, all started to get active around this time.
But the historians, if you see the history of Islam in America, Ahmadiyyas has never been declared as Muslim or Islamic movement. Their movement to come to the US.
That's immigrant ones now, but before they were.
Yeah, even like we have some papers and books written in 1937, 1938, specifically by South Asian scholars.
Yeah, but that's because South Asian scholars are very anti-Ahmadi.
Yeah.
That's why.
And their movement, the Ahmadiyya's movement, migration to US was called as a forced migration. because they were suppressed in South Asia.
Yeah.
But but their concept.
But they played a very pivotal role because they exposed people to the concept of Islam, even if it was not pure Islam or what we call Orthodox Islam. This is exactly what happened with the Moorish Science Temple, with the Nation of Islam, and the Ahmadiyya movement. If these movements that were not traditional in Orthodox Islam did not exist, communities would actually not be able to find Orthodox Islam. So anyone who says that these movements were not contributors were actually wrong, because these movements were the gateway to Orthodox Islam. And if you see the Nation of Islam, just like Ahmadiyya, especially the original nation, they did not have Orthodox theology, but they were a gateway for people to come and eventually accept Orthodox Islam. And I think that's the important point with these groups. Even though they were not, what we call quote-unquote traditional Orthodox, they were very important in bringing people to at least understand what Islam can potentially be. And that's what these movements did in the 20s, in the 30s, and in the 40s, until you started to get more traditional Muslims and Orthodox Muslims. And what these movements did was really important for black communities, was for the first time, they linked Islam and whatever understanding of Islam to identity, self-reliance, and resistance. And we talked about that earlier. One thing that Islam did in America, which was also brought from Africa, North Africa, India, Pakistan, Islam was seen as a tool of resistance against colonizers. Because even in South Asia, in North Africa, it was Muslim scholars and Muslim activists who were the ones who were resisting colonization against the British, the French, the Dutch, and all of them. And so what they did was these movements here started to see that Islam was a form of resistance to colonization and to oppression, and they started to do that. Until officially, if you look at then Malcolm X, when he took his famous trip to Africa, and he gave his famous speech of actually linking the African American struggle here with the international struggle for freedom and decolonization, these movements were the first ones to actually start it. Before Malcolm X, before even MLK, and their linking of the African American struggle here with the international struggle for freedom and decolonization. So that was the importance of these movements. And then eventually, of course, you had people like Malcolm X and the Nation, and then the move towards orthodoxy that came later. And then people like Imam Muhammad that actually split the Nation of Islam and brought part of it to Orthodox Islam. And we had a session on that already, and you guys, we'll end it here. But one of the things to, just to end on a few points, Islam was a symbol of resistance in America for a very long time. So when we immigrant Muslim communities, and I think this is where there's a disconnect. When we immigrant Muslim communities came to this country, we came for a better life in many ways. It was economic upward mobility. It was to go to educational institutions. It was to go to the Harvards and the Yales and the Columbias of this country. It was to come here for a better life after decades and decades of struggle by black communities using Islam as a form of resistance. They used Islam as a way to resist oppression and Jim Crow and law enforcement agencies, and it empowered them. So here comes a legacy of Islam, of black Islam in America, that has used Islam as a form of resistance against oppression. And then come us immigrant Muslims, and we're all about a better life, and we're all about higher education and economic upward mobility, and we live in our suburbs. And so there's a disconnect of the experience of Islam in America for black communities and how they engaged and understood and had experienced Islam versus us immigrants, who, many of us who came here were understanding Islam anew and didn't understand it in the historical context of the struggle for resistance in America. And that's until today where you see much of the disconnect, if we're going to be honest with ourselves. You see African American communities still finding liberation in Islam, finding self-reliance in Islam, finding identity in Islam, and then you see immigrant communities whose understanding of Islam is not based on liberation, but based on almost, you go to certain places, it's almost based on prosperity gospel. In Christianity, you have this understanding of prosperity gospel. You go to the masajid around the country. I was just in California this last weekend, and I'm going to be honest. I went to masajid that were worth $10, $12, $15 million. Right? You don't have that in black Muslim communities. You have it in the immigrant Muslim communities. That disconnect is real because you have immigrant communities who have very different experience, whose understanding of Islam is a traditional understanding, an orthodox understanding, who many times dismiss the historical understanding of Islam that black communities had, because we say they're not orthodox. They understood Islam differently. It's not real Islam. We talk about it's not real Islam, but what it was a gateway to understanding Islam itself. And this experience, we still see the impact and the disconnect of these two communities, because they experience Islam very differently than how many immigrant communities experience Islam. And I think if we are to understand each other better, this has to be understood by immigrant communities, that this is an experience. Islam for black Muslims for centuries and decades was a form of resistance. We don't know what resistance looks like in many ways as immigrant American Muslim communities. We have a very different experience. Our experience is that of, we live in our comfortable spaces. Yes, we faced a lot of challenges coming to this country. There was a lot of challenges and hardship, but once we got here, our experience of faith, its engagement with it, and understanding with it was very different. I'll end here and we can open it up for conversation.
Yeah. All right. I mean, the floor is already